He was brilliant, articulate, politically savvy, and well-connected. He became a writer, a public speaker, a recurring presence on American college campuses, and ultimately the intellectual face of the Star-Spangled Fascists in the 1930s and beyond. But this godfather of American fascism hid a personal secret for decades that would have ended his career before it even started. This is Star-Spangled Fascism, the Godfather.
One of the things I combated, and it cost me a great deal, was the popular idea that fascism was something very evil which we had to avoid and fight.
I'm historian Bradley W. Hart, author of the award-winning book Hitler's American Friends. In this podcast, we're examining fascist leaders and movements that have emerged here in the United States over the past century. We'll look at what fueled their authoritarian ambitions, the supporters who flocked to them, and the Americans who stood in their way. In our last episode of Season 1, we're looking at the life and career of a man who was once called America's #1 fascist intellectual. Lawrence Dennis seemed to know everybody who mattered in 1930s Washington and New York. He branded himself as a prophet of a new world being born out of the Great Depression, a world that, for him, included an inevitable march toward American fascism. But this fascist oracle, who celebrated the ideas of Hitler and Mussolini, carried a secret his entire life, a secret he hid from even his closest friends. To learn more about this enigmatic figure, I'm turning to a leading authority on the politics of 1930s America. My guest on the podcast is Dr. Nancy Beck Young, chair of the Department of History at the University of Houston. Nancy, thank you so much for being on Star-Spangled Fascism.
Thank you for having me.
Our topic today is a man that probably none of our listeners have heard about before, a man named Lawrence Dennis. But at one time, Lawrence Dennis was a very prominent name, especially on college campuses across the United States, which I find to be an interesting aspect of his career that we will certainly talk about. Lawrence Dennis is born in 1893 in Atlanta. He is actually born as a mixed-race young man. Nancy, tell me about Lawrence Dennis's background and how this feeds into his later activities.
Lawrence Dennis had a mother who was Black and a father who was of French and Indian descent. This is a moment in American history when Jim Crow segregation is at its worst. The 1890s are just 30 years removed from the Civil War and just 20 years removed from the end of Reconstruction. White Southerners are solidifying their control over the politics and the economics of the region and really do not wish to share stage in any way, shape, or form with persons of color. And in the United States, the one-drop rule governed, so anyone with one drop of African-American blood made that person subject to the rigidity of Jim Crow.
And so Lawrence Dennis, from a very young age, has this sort of mixed-race background, but he also has this career that he embarks on, if you can really call it that. At the age of 4, he becomes actually a preacher at the behest of his mother. Is it common in this period in the South to have 4-year-old preachers?
It was not uncommon, especially in more charismatic, evangelical houses of worship, for someone to speak as the Spirit moved. So I suspect it was something that started young Lawrence Dennis on his way. I think his mother saw the potential. There was also a white promoter involved. And for about 4 years, Dennis traveled not just around the United States, but around the world doing his thing. And according to one report, 5,000 conversions resulted from his preaching. His travels also demonstrated his intellect and his ability to pick up languages. He learned to speak French and German and some Spanish.
So from this background that I think today we would see as almost exploitative in a lot of ways, you're taking a child all over the world, putting them in front of a stage, asking them really to perform. This would be deeply troubling in a contemporary context. At the age of 20, the young Lawrence Dennis makes the decision to distance himself from this entire world and actually to distance himself from his racial background as well. He leaves his mother, by his own account. He somehow gets his way accepted into Phillips Exeter and then eventually Harvard University. It's not entirely clear to me from the historiography as to how he manages to do this. Partially, this may have been some of the monetary resources he had by virtue of this earlier speaking tour. But he's really now made the journey from being this sort of itinerant young preacher to entering some of the most elite and blue-blooded institutions in the country. How difficult would that have been to do?
So the only way he could have gotten into Phillips Exeter and Harvard was to hide any and all evidence of Black parentage. This is a moment in time where not only did one have to be white to attend such institutions, one needed to have some privilege. So Dennis's education at these institutions is, to choose a word, startling that he made it that far.
So Dennis at this point is, to use the term of the era, he's passing effectively as a white person, though he is of mixed race ancestry. While he is at Harvard, he makes a number of blue-blooded connections, we could put it, people who will become prominent in the business world, in the political world. But of course, we think, don't really know about his background. But this idea that Dennis is always trying to conceal his background to maintain his status within these circles, I think becomes a feature of his career later on, as we will see. After leaving Harvard, Dennis becomes actually a military officer. So he enlists in the U.S. Army during World War I. He uses his elite connections to get a job as a military policeman, entering as actually a lieutenant. But of course, the military itself is racially segregated in this era. So this should have been a position that wouldn't have been available to him at all.
So his entrance into the military and his entrance as an officer is more evidence of the success with which he had been able to pass as a white man in this stage of his life. This was an incredibly important moment for Dennis in that he develops the connections that he's able to use later to first gain employment in the U.S. State Department and then later on Wall Street. So he is very effective in developing connections while he is at Harvard and developing more connections when he is in the military that he uses to his advantage at the end of the Great War.
So as you mentioned a moment ago, 1920, Lawrence Dennis gets a job at the State Department. He actually becomes a State Department official. He is sent off to Haiti at one point. He's actually sent to Romania. He does additional work in Latin America, propping up governments that are friendly to the United States. What's going on in Latin America in this period, and what kind of a role were people like Dennis playing in diplomacy?
The United States is pursuing good neighbor policies to try to make for friendly governmental relationships, intra-hemispheric relationships that will benefit not only U.S. diplomacy, but U.S. corporate interests as well. It is looking both for additional sources for raw materials for its industry and markets for its production. He becomes cynical about that type of work when he seeks and is turned down for a promotion in the State Department. And that's an important turning point in the Dennis story as we see what happens when he becomes critical of an organization that he had previously been loyal to.
Dennis he's denied this promotion. He thinks that this is because he's been, to some extent, stabbed in the back. But then he goes through what is often called in D.C. the revolving door. He goes into the corporate world directly from the government and actually gets a job with a Wall Street firm in 1927. But when he joins Wall Street, he's not enamored with this new corporate world that he is joining. And in fact, he becomes known as a thorn in the side of the management of the firm, so much so that he never actually will hold another proper job again after this experience. But while he's working on Wall Street, by his own account, he is becoming very skeptical of the state of the world economy. So 1929, it seems like Lawrence Dennis's prophecy about the U.S. economy comes true. The stock market crashes, there's a series of bank failures, people lose their savings, they lose their homes, there's no federal deposit insurance, and so if your bank goes under, effectively you're wiped out. Lawrence Dennis now can somewhat plausibly claim that he's predicted this.
The stock market crash ruins the lives of countless Americans, causes banks to fail, businesses to shutter, and the economy is in the tank. As a result of all of this, Lawrence Dennis looks like the prophet, and this causes people to be fascinated with him, causes policymakers to be interested. How did you know this? But causes folks on Wall Street to never want to hire him again.
After 1929, Dennis kind of catapults into what we might call national celebrity. He's called to testify before Congress. He has an extensive list of people who he claims that he meets with during this period, including prominent representatives, senators, and governors, including Governor Huey Long of Louisiana, who Lawrence Dennis will later claim is actually the model of how fascism might arrive in the United States. Who is Huey Long, and why does Dennis see him as a sort of American proto-fascist?
Huey Long was a fascinating figure in Louisiana politics first and then U.S. politics second. Huey Long had built a political empire in Louisiana, and Huey Long and his machine ran the state. So much so that after he was elected to the U.S. Senate, he did not resign the governorship until he was good and ready to leave Louisiana. And Louisianans loved him because of the additional services he had provided. Long understood poverty, and so Long did not so much wave the bloody shirt of the Civil War and Reconstruction periods, racial politics, and focused more on economics. Dennis agreed that some intervention by the government in the economy was necessary. And so there was an overlap, if you will, between arguments that Long was making and arguments that Dennis was making.
And in 1932, Dennis writes a book entitled provocatively, Is Capitalism Doomed? It's a book that effectively is advocating a new form of the U.S. economic system that is largely in line with some of the more aggressive proposals being put forth by people like Huey Long. And we should remember that simultaneously, this is now the early 1930s. Adolf Hitler comes to power in 1933. Benito Mussolini has already been running Italy for quite some time. And actually, Italy is less impacted by the Great Depression, let's say, than some other European countries, including Germany, of course, which is devastated again by effectively another economic crisis. What is Dennis really advocating for here?
Dennis is thinking more about what is required of governments and economies in the modern industrialized age, that capitalism has run its course, that it could no longer function successfully in a country as large and as complicated as the United States. Dennis believed that the state needed complete control over questions of budget, questions of taxes, and also needed a loyal military force to keep the public in line. Dennis was a technocrat. He believed that new systems needed new methods of governance, and he believed in centralizing power over those new systems. He was not concerned about autocracy.
In 1967, Lawrence Dennis sat down for a remarkable interview conducted by William Keeler for Columbia University's Oral History Research Office. And thanks to the generosity of the Oral History Archives at Columbia, we can let Lawrence Dennis tell his story in his own words.
I took what was then considered a pro-fascist view. I said that Hitler and Mussolini were rising to meet the economic crisis and that we would have to do much the same thing. I did not in any way identify myself with those movements, but I defended them and tried to explain them. And that got me under considerable criticism and attack as being a fascist. I said the United States will have to go fascist in the same way that Germany and Italy have gone. The government has to meet the depression.
And so by the mid-1930s, he has actually embraced the label of fascism. A lot of people we talk about here on the podcast never called themselves fascists. And in fact, in 1936, he writes a very provocative book called The Coming American Fascism, where he actually predicts that fascism is inevitable in the United States, that economic system you described is going to happen regardless of what anyone wants because capitalism is doomed effectively. By this period, actually, Germany is pretty much recovered from the Depression. Hitler at least claims that there's 0% unemployment, largely because he's introduced conscription. Italy is doing economically better than a lot of countries and had never actually been in the darkest depths of the Depression. So it's in some ways makes a certain amount of perverse sense that Lawrence Dennis thinks that fascism economic policies are successful. And in 1936, he actually goes off to Italy and meets with Mussolini. He meets with Hitler's emissaries in Germany. He watches Hitler address 120,000 people in Nuremberg.
Hitler, Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
And these regimes roll out the red carpet for him. He's actually referred to within the German press and in German documents as a fascist leader or a fascist intellectual. But with this notoriety, we have to imagine that this is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way. And as we mentioned earlier, Lawrence Dennis doesn't have a job. He actually hasn't been employed since he left his Wall Street firm. Who's funding Lawrence Dennis during all of this? Is it the Germans and the Italians?
Lawrence Dennis has multiple sources of funding to support his writing, and some of his money comes from German sources, but some of his money comes from folks like the architect Philip Johnson, who gave him $5,000. DeWitt Wallace publishes his writings in Reader's Digest. Lawrence was adept at fitting into his environment, made himself a regular in the social circle of elite Washington and elite Wall Street all at the same time. And this means dinner parties and drinks with the leading financiers and the leading government officials. He keeps company with a dizzying array of folks, but this is because Dennis is able to trade on those folks he's known for a long time.
These elite social connections allowed Dennis to earn a living writing books, newsletters, articles, ghostwriting, and giving speeches about his theoretical fascist beliefs, a very lucrative grift at the time. On Capitol Hill, prominent politicians including Senator Burton K. Wheeler, Senator Gerald P. Nye, Senator Robert Taft, and Congressman Hamilton Fish III helped promote his writings. Dennis described these men not only as his intellectual followers, but also as his close friends. According to Dennis, business leaders including General Robert Wood of Sears Roebuck and even aviator Charles Lindbergh revered and embraced his intellect and his bold messages. Both of these men would go on to become leaders in the key isolationist group of the late 1930s, the America First Committee. He even included Joseph Kennedy, the one-time U.S. ambassador to Great Britain and the father of a future president, among his close contacts.
I went to call on him several times in his Massachusetts house there near the Cape, and I called on him once or twice down in Florida. We had a very keen friendship. Our views coincided very much.
But perhaps his greatest backers were the Nazis, who secretly funded his efforts to spread his fascist views in the U.S., even if they didn't perfectly align with Hitler. He even offered the Nazis some personal advice when he last visited Germany.
They wanted to know whether I thought America would stay out of the war, and I told them that I thought the best thing they could do would be to ease up on the Jews and modify their anti-Semitism.
Dennis did, in fact, believe that the United States needed to abandon its current political and economic system and adopt fascism. And he hoped that fascism in the United States could be kinder and gentler. His fascism is never as anti-Semitic as, say, Hitler's Nazism. But there are signs in what Dennis says that suggests his willingness to tolerate Hitler's anti-Semitic fascism. For example, Dennis tells the Nazis, and I'm quoting now, "Treat Jews more or less the way we treat Negroes in the United States."
It was the Jews who were building up most sentiment against Germany, and the Germans were largely responsible for that. And I said it would certainly be to your advantage to cut down on that anti-Semitism. But I didn't get anywhere. They, of course, didn't argue with me. They just listened.
Yeah, I think a lot of our listeners are probably wondering, how does Dennis essentially reconcile his own racial background and his childhood with his fascism? How does he effectively put himself into the same camp as people who are so deeply anti-Semitic and racist in other ways too?
I think that this gets down to his own psychology and how he sees himself, and the fact that for almost the entirety of the 20th century, he has been passing as white. He has been essentially ignoring, erasing from the story, if you will, his blackness. And I think that it is from that self-erasure that he is able to consort with the vocal fascists who are not subtle in expressing their commitment to racial purity.
But for all his success and notoriety in the 1930s, Lawrence Dennis faces a rude awakening when his theories put him on the wrong side of the greatest conflict in human history. He'll soon face the might of the Department of Justice in court and be fighting for not only his reputation, but also his freedom. So we often forget that in the mid-1930s, the U.S. is still in pretty dire economic straits. There is some recovery that's come through Roosevelt's New Deal policies. You can imagine someone like a Lawrence Dennis looking to Mussolini and Hitler in Europe and seeing these supposed economic accomplishments happening there, some of which are real, some of which are also because they have remilitarized and put everyone, or every man at least, into the armed forces. But what do we think that Dennis is thinking when he sees these, for lack of a better term, practical fascists who are actually putting these ideas into motion versus him as a theorist? What does he see in these men?
So when Lawrence Dennis looks at Hitler and Mussolini, he sees two important world leaders who are attempting to do in real-world situations what he has advocated as theory and philosophy. His attraction is stronger for Mussolini than it is for Hitler. He has a photo of Mussolini over his bed. Hitler, as a person, was a little bit more difficult to take, shall we say. So maybe there's not a personal affinity toward Hitler, but there is an admiration for Hitler's putting into place a fascist system that Lawrence Dennis believes is appropriate for the future of the world's political economy.
By 1940, he actually receives a remarkable number of invitations to speak on college campuses across the country. This is something I found very strange in my research. What do you make of that? So you can imagine how divisive that would be.
I think some of that comes from the isolationism that was part of Dennis's political views. The country was still divided over the question of war. And Lawrence Dennis is talking about the importance of isolation. He thought it more important for the United States to build up its sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere and leave Europe to Germany's control. Let Japan have control in Asia, and world relations would be much better that way. So his message met with a friendly ear on college campuses where there was not necessarily an eagerness for another world war.
I was always an isolationist. I took my isolation from George Washington's farewell address and from a long line of classics. I didn't believe in intervention. I had seen the working of intervention in my government service in Haiti, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And in all those situations and countries, I found that intervention did not work.
So by 1941, Lawrence Dennis, I think it's fair to say, is fairly famous. Life magazine actually labels him as the, quote, #1 intellectual fascist. But in many ways, 1941 is a dangerous year to be associated with fascism in a lot of ways. Once December 7th takes place and the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. What kind of restrictions come in with the declaration of war, and how do they affect people like Lawrence Dennis?
The country looks very different in 1942 than it did in 41 or 40 or 39 or 38. There's less freedom as everyone is making sacrifices for the war effort. Dennis is not allowed to join the army. He had served in World War I, as you will remember, as a military police officer, and Roosevelt says no to Dennis' entry into the military in World War II. His labeling is the #1 intellectual fascist. Others had called him the brains of the fascist movement, etc. This was just too much to take for a country that was at war against fascism and joined together in its politics, at least in pursuit of victory over Germany, Italy, and Japan. So this sees a moment of decline for Dennis. Dennis tries to do some cleanup of his reputation. So, for example, in 1943, he breaks with Adolf Hitler for the slaughter of the Jews once news about the concentration camps and the Holocaust starts to leak out. His attempt to clean up doesn't really succeed. Dennis is painted as a tool of the Nazis.
So unsurprisingly to a lot of our listeners, especially listeners who heard our last episode about the FBI in this period, the FBI has been investigating Lawrence Dennis for years. And initially, the FBI is very interested in where Lawrence Dennis's lifestyle is being funded from. He has multiple houses, he has a car. For a man who doesn't have a job in the way that most of us would conceive of it, this seems like a pretty opulent lifestyle. Now, of course, Dennis admits that there are people who have been his patron over the years, and the FBI sort of interrogates those individuals as well, and they confirm they've given him some money. But the real question here is whether Dennis has been receiving money from the German government itself. There's no real proof that ever seems to emerge on that question. Historians might have opinions or suspicions about where these funds were coming from or where they were coming from indirectly, but the FBI seemingly is unable to find commission of a crime that Dennis can actually be charged with, which of course is a requirement for a prosecution prior to the war.
I learned from my neighbors that the FBI agents had been going to every house in the neighborhood asking if they could give them any information about me. And of course they couldn't. They could only say that I was a good neighbor and who were the people who went to see him? Well, they didn't know who went to see me or who my contacts were. It was a purely formal and futile investigation. It didn't bother me at all.
1943, now that we're in the war, the FBI and the federal government begins considering prosecuting Dennis on something like sedition charges for his pro-fascist activity. But of course, sedition requires a level of proof as well that in Dennis's case doesn't really seem to exist. And in fact, the FBI brings Dennis in for questioning. You can imagine how unpleasant that would be, especially during a wartime situation where he's asked about his views and about his contacts in the Nazi government. And really, he just denies that he has any to some extent. As absurd as that sounds, he denies that he's really ever been in touch with significant representatives of the German government or taken any money. And then he name drops some of his famous political friends, including people like Burton K. Wheeler and Gerald P. Nye, and even Hamilton Fish III, the isolationist representative from New York. And this seemingly works, and he again is not charged by the FBI in 1943. But all this is about to change in 1944 when we get into what's called the Great Sedition Trial. And listeners who have heard our last podcast featuring Dr. John Fox from the FBI are familiar with the prosecutor in this case, a man named John Rogge, who brings this mass prosecution against several dozen accused seditionists. And this trial becomes a farce. The judge actually dies halfway through the trial, and the government essentially decides that they're not going to bring back this prosecution.
The government was constantly up against the challenge. What evidence is there that any of these defendants ever conspired to cause mutiny and insubordination? The case should have been dropped. The judge should have dismissed the case in the first week of the trial. But I think that was what really killed the poor man. I think he was worrying about it. He died of a heart attack after the trial had been going on for 7 or 8 months.
Why does this prosecution really happen at all, in your opinion? John Fox was able to share some of the DOJ background on this, but there's a political background here within the FDR administration as well.
The Roosevelt administration wants to send a message that fascist, seditious behavior is not okay in the United States. And as a way of keeping Americans eagerly supportive of the war effort. So it's all run through the calculus of what is in the best interest of maintaining popular support for the war and othering the ideas of the fascists who are brought up on charges of sedition.
But the trial ends up being a catastrophe, although Lawrence Dennis puts in a great deal of time, effort, and money into preparing his defense. He prepares 8,000 exhibits that he is intending to present in court. I don't think he actually presents any of them. And in the aftermath of this trial, Dennis then publishes this massive book. It's hundreds of pages long, called A Trial on Trial. This is published in 1946, and it's his effort to try to vindicate himself. He actually includes a lot of these exhibits in the book that he was never allowed to really put into the court records. So it's his attempt to try to absolve himself, I think, of these very serious charges that the government has tried to bring forward. It becomes very difficult, I think, for anyone to associate with any of the sedition defendants in a lot of ways, even after the war ends. These are people who have been tried and, while not convicted, have been accused of some pretty grievous things. After the war, he launches some other newsletters that are focused on economic and political issues. But interestingly, as the U.S. moves towards a more militarized stance in the Cold War, actual military in Korea and Vietnam, Lawrence Dennis has a weird afterlife in an era when the U.S. is now intervening in a very different type of war.
From World War II through the 1950s and into the early and mid-1960s, Democratic Party politicians were, to a person, interventionist in their foreign policy. They believed in the pursuit of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. They believed in the policy of containment. They believed in programs like the Marshall Plan and friendships with foreign governments to advance the American foreign policy agenda of anti-Soviet communism. By the mid-1960s and certainly the late 1960s, as the Vietnam War worsens and there is not an easy exit strategy from it, younger generations are calling into question that interventionist foreign policy record and are looking to intellectual architects of isolationism. And that is where Lawrence Dennis has his entree back into political relevance as his writings get a new look in this moment of questioning the excesses of American engagement overseas.
I think that we should withdraw from Vietnam because I don't see how we can ever hope to win in Vietnam. We can fight there indefinitely, and the Vietnamese can lose hundreds of thousands of millions of men, but they still have more to lose. As long as they have the will to fight, what can we do?
And a lot of his arguments throughout his career, actually, relating to isolationism or supporting the isolationist cause, seem to relate to him seeing the United States and Great Britain, which he criticizes very heavily, as lacking the moral standing to really tell other countries what to do, in part seemingly because of the country's own fraught racial history, because of the history of Jim Crow and racial oppression here. And of course, the fact that Lawrence Dennis is mixed race, I think, adds another layer to this. To what extent do you think that Lawrence Dennis's own background and his identity, that he has concealed the truth of his identity his entire life, feeds into his foreign policy thinking?
We cannot understand Lawrence Dennis as a thinker about global politics without understanding how Lawrence Dennis understood himself in the world as a person of mixed race background. I think the two are intrinsically linked. I think that his own concerns about the system that would have rejected him had they known the truth of him shapes very greatly how he responds to structures of democracy and capitalism in the United States, and just as much how he responds to the growing fascist movement in Europe in the 20s and 30s and beyond. His policy views are linked to his biography, to put it that simply.
So Lawrence Dennis dies in 1977 at the age of 83. Apparently, towards the end of his life, he actually grew out his hair, which he had actually kept very short for most of his career. One biographer refers to it as looking like an afro. But what's interesting, I think, as well, is that he never, to my knowledge, embraces either his own heritage nor the civil rights movement that by 1977 has come quite a ways. So what is the Lawrence Dennis legacy today? We have this man who has such a fascinating biography, a man who I think we can easily see has these internal contradictions that must have weighed upon him in very real ways on a daily basis. What's this man's legacy today?
The legacy of Lawrence Dennis is very much a cautionary tale. Be critical of those who present an easy answer. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what he was doing with his advocacy of fascism. And I think that he was at his best when he was at the 30,000 foot level. He was never good at granular politics and figuring out how to implement a policy to achieve a certain ideological end. And so I think the cautionary tale is the way to view Dennis. Beware of those who give easy answers.
I always saw that war would be bad business for us, that we couldn't win a war. And as, of course, I see it now. We fought World War II, and Russia and communism won it. We didn't win the war. We had no reason to fight Germany. We should have let Hitler and Russia fight it out. There was no danger for us in that. But now saying that is not being pro-Hitler, it is simply being realistic.
My guest on the podcast has been Dr. Nancy Beck Young, chair of the Department of History at the University of Houston and a fellow alum of Rachel Maddow's fantastic podcast series, Ultra. Nancy, thank you so much for being here. How does this compare to Ultra?
This has been amazing, and I would view this as one of the children, if you will, of Ultra, as that amazing podcast and book are going to cause more historians to dig into the little-known history of American fascism.
It's an exciting time to be a historian, and thank you again for being here.
My pleasure. This has been fun.
Our special thanks to the Oral History Archives at Columbia University for allowing us to use the fantastic interview with Lawrence Dennis. And a special thanks to you for listening to Season 1 of Star-Spangled Fascism. We hope there will be a Season 2 of the show coming up. You can help make that happen by telling your friends about the podcast, subscribing to the show wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. We want to thank everyone who has made this show possible, especially our wonderful guests, Arnie Bernstein, Brett Siciliano, Scott Beekman, Charles Gallagher, John Fox, Pamela Nadell, and Nancy Beck Young. Thank you so much. We couldn't have done it without you. And a big thanks to MSNBC's Rachel Maddow for being our very first guest on the show and for inspiring us to get started telling these important stories. This program was edited by Brian Fantinelli, mixed and mastered by Joseph Powers, and executive produced by Brendan Gokel. Be sure to subscribe to the Star-Spangled Fascism podcast wherever you get your podcasts, on our YouTube page, and follow us now on social media. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Dr. B.W. Hart. I'll be posting previews from our upcoming episodes there, and feel free to leave your comments. If you have a question about the podcast, email us at questions@starspangledfascismpodcast.com. I'm Bradley W. Hart. Thank you for listening.